I'm Eleanor Foster. I'm 69, and I live in a small house near Lake Merrick in Maine. Most days are quiet, just me, my crossword puzzles, and a stubborn tea kettle that whistles whether I ask it to or not. I used to teach art at the local high school before I retired. My husband, Daniel, passed away 5 winters ago, and since then, the world has felt a little dimmer, a little smaller. Mornings became routines, not choices, and my voice didn't echo through the rooms like it used to. When my son James called to say he was getting married, my heart did that soft flutter thing it hadn't done in years. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be a moment for us to reconnect, something to draw us closer again. Like when he was young and still looked to me first. I offered to help with the rehearsal dinner, maybe bake those apple bars he used to sneak from the tray before they cooled. He thanked me, said that wasn't necessary, that his fiancée, Tessa, had everything handled. He sounded kind, maybe even appreciative, but there was a distance in his tone I couldn't quite place. Still, I tucked away that little flicker of hope. I pressed my favorite cardigan. I wrapped a loaf of banana bread in linen. I told myself the wedding would be beautiful and full of love. I told myself I would be seen. But what happened instead wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It was something much harder to name. The kind of quiet where you realize you're no longer part of the picture. Not because you left, but because someone gently cropped you out while you weren't looking. And that, I think, is where my real story begins. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before the sun. I laid out the rose-colored dress I'd been saving for a special occasion and pressed my blue cardigan with the tiny pearl buttons. I wrapped the banana bread in a clean linen towel and tied it with a ribbon, the same way I used to pack James's school lunches when he was little. I didn't wear much makeup, just a little powder and a soft pink lipstick. The drive to the resort took just under an hour, the road winding past trees just starting to turn with the early signs of autumn. I remember thinking that the lake would make a beautiful backdrop for the photos, and maybe I'd even be in one of them. When I arrived, a young woman with a clipboard greeted me at the entrance. She handed me a name tag that simply read, Eleanor Foster. No title. No mention of my role in James's life. Just my name, printed in a plain font and stuck on like a guest at a networking event. Inside, the reception hall shimmered with light. The walls were glass from floor to ceiling, overlooking the lake. I spotted James near the front, standing with a group of people I didn't recognize, all laughing, holding champagne glasses. He didn't look my way. One of the event staff checked a list and smiled before leading me toward the back of the room. My table was near the exit, behind a pillar, next to a man who sold mortgages and a woman who raised alpacas in Vermont. They were friendly, in the way that strangers sometimes are, but neither asked who I was or how I knew the groom. I sat quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled when they smiled. The music played softly, the servers floated by with trays of tiny hors d'oeuvres, and someone gave a toast about love and new beginnings. James laughed from across the room. I hadn't heard him laugh like that in years. I watched him dance with Tessa's mother. I watched him toast his new in-laws. I watched him walk past my table without pausing, his eyes scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone else. He never saw me. By dessert, the bread I had brought was still sitting in my purse, untouched. I hadn't given it to anyone. I didn't know where it belonged. There was no moment that said, this is the time. This is where you matter. I stayed until the cake was cut. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I even stood in the group photo, though no one told me where to stand. Then I slipped away before the dancing started, quietly, the same way I had come. As I walked back to my car, I kept thinking about that name tag. Eleanor Foster. Not James's mother, not family, just a name on a sticker, peeled off and tossed into the glove box before I started the engine. The silence of that drive home said more than any speech ever could. A week after the wedding, James called. His voice was bright, almost too cheerful, like he was trying to smooth over something he wasn't sure how to name. He said Tessa would be out with friends and asked if I'd like to come over for dinner. Just the two of us. I said yes right away. Maybe he realized the wedding had been too much, too fast. Maybe this was his way of saying sorry, even without saying the words. I baked a tray of oatmeal cookies the way I used to when he was 12 and stayed up too late watching cartoons. The drive to his house took longer than I remembered. His new neighborhood looked like a magazine spread, all trimmed lawns and identical porch lights. I noticed the doorbell camera before I even reached the steps. Something about it made me straighten my cardigan. James opened the door barefoot and grinning. He gave me a quick hug that barely touched my shoulders. I smiled anyway. I told him the cookies were still warm. He nodded, thanked me, and said dinner was almost ready. The house was quiet, too quiet. No pots bubbling on the stove, no scent of garlic or onions in the air. I stepped into the kitchen and paused. The table was set for two, plates, silverware, even a bottle of wine already uncorked. But there was no food. Beside my plate, clipped neatly and held down with a blue pen, was a stack of papers. I stared at them for a second, thinking maybe they were part of a game or something unrelated. But then I saw the words on top: durable power of attorney, financial access, immediate effect. He sat down across from me and poured the wine. Said something about wanting to be prepared, that it was nothing serious, just a safety measure. Everyone was doing it now. I nodded slowly, the warmth I brought with me fading with every sentence he spoke. He told me I didn't have to sign tonight, just to take a look. Think it over. No pressure, he said. But the pen was already uncapped and placed beside the stack. I didn't touch it. I didn't touch the wine either. The papers didn't say son, they said agent. They didn't say trust, they said control. He talked about how it would make things smoother, cleaner, easier, if something ever happened. I looked at the candles he had lit and realized they weren't for ambiance. They were cover. I told him I'd take the documents home to review. He smiled, said sure, as if it made no difference. We sat for a few more minutes, talking about his neighbor's new fence and a show I hadn't seen. I nodded at the right moments. He didn't ask about my week. When I stood to leave, he gave me another shallow hug. I walked out holding the cookies and the documents. Neither felt like a gift. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting in the cool air like it could clear the weight in my chest. At home, I didn't even take off my coat. I sat on the couch with the folder on my lap. I kept thinking about how quiet the house had been, not just empty of sound, but of intention. The kind of quiet that feels rehearsed. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just listened to the hum of the refrigerator and let the silence tell me something I hadn't wanted to admit. Love, when turned into leverage, doesn't sound like anger. It sounds like paperwork. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't know where I stood. When I got home from James's house, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I left my coat on, sat at the edge of the couch, and rested my hands on my knees. The folder of legal documents was still in my bag, but I didn't need to look at them again to feel the weight they carried. The house was quiet in a way that didn't comfort me. It felt like it was waiting for something, or maybe holding its breath with me. After a while, I stood and walked to the basement door. The stairs creaked more than they used to, and the air grew colder with each step. At the far end, behind the old washing machine, sat a dusty metal box with a key taped underneath. Daniel had kept everything in that box. I hadn't opened it since the winter after he passed. My hands trembled a little as I lifted the lid. Inside, the folders were stacked neatly, labeled in his blocky handwriting: receipts, titles, tax records, a will I had read once but never deeply. At the very bottom was a sealed envelope. On the front, in Daniel's careful script, was my name, Eleanor. I sat on the cement floor, knees stiff, and opened it. It wasn't long, just a paragraph. But it said everything. He told me he knew I'd never ask for help, even when I needed it. He wrote that he had set things up so I'd never have to rely on anyone. Not James, not anyone, not out of distrust, but out of understanding. He said money changes people. Sometimes it reveals who they already were, and that this was his way of loving me long after he was gone. The paper listed account numbers, 2 investment portfolios, a small rental property in North Carolina, a fixed annuity, a trust I didn't know existed. I ran the numbers twice, then again just to be sure. It was over $6 million. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something deeper, like standing in the middle of a storm and realizing someone had already built you a shelter. Quiet, steady, thoughtfully placed stones that had waited patiently for you to see them. I sat there for a long time, the cold of the floor pressing through my coat, the letter resting on my lap. I thought about Daniel, about the way he used to lay his hand on the small of my back when I was tired, how he never raised his voice, but always made me feel safe. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and the envelope beside me. I wasn't writing anything yet. I was just sitting with the truth, letting it settle, letting it rewrite the part of my story I thought I already knew. It wasn't joy that came over me. It wasn't power. It was the sense that someone had seen me, really seen me, even in my quietest moments, and loved me enough to protect what I hadn't seen coming. Daniel hadn't left me money. He'd left me freedom, choice, time. He'd left me the ability to say no, and that, in the silence of that night, felt like the most sacred thing anyone had ever given me. The next morning, I pulled open the drawer in the hallway and found an old birthday card Daniel had saved. On the back was a phone number, faded with time, scribbled in his handwriting. It belonged to Sarah Delaney, one of his colleagues from years ago, now retired from estate law. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, maybe more. But when I called, she picked up on the second ring. Her voice was older than I remembered, but steady, warm. I told her everything, about the dinner, the papers, the letter Daniel left me. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Sarah invited me over the next afternoon. Her house smelled like cinnamon and worn-out paperbacks. We sat at her kitchen table with mugs of tea that stayed warm longer than I expected. I handed her the envelope and documents. She read every page without rushing, eyes moving like someone who had seen too many people wait too long to act. When she looked up, she didn't ask questions. She simply said I had more power than I realized. That was the first moment I felt the ground steady under me again. We laid out a plan. A private revocable trust in my name only. No joint access, no successor trustee unless I chose one. The property in North Carolina would be retitled. My accounts would be secured, moved under the trust's umbrella. Medical directives rewritten with clear conditions for any future power of attorney. 2 independent doctors required. No one acting alone. Every step we took felt like I was redrawing a map. Not just legally, but emotionally. I wasn't just protecting money. I was protecting space, voice, dignity. I had spent so many years shrinking myself for peace that I didn't notice how easy I'd become to bypass. When Sarah asked if I wanted to name anyone for the future, I shook my head. Not yet. I told her, maybe never, and she understood. The final documents came in a thick folder. Everything crisp, labeled, deliberate. Sarah handed me a pen and sat back. No pressure, no speeches. I signed one page, then the next. Hands steady. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean. Each signature felt like a sentence I hadn't been allowed to speak out loud. I am not here for your convenience. I am not a fallback. I am not yours to manage. We finished our tea in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but earned. Before I left, Sarah handed me the folder and said to keep it close, but not obvious. I nodded, already knowing the spot under the sink where no one ever reached. That night, I slid the folder behind a box of dishwasher pods and shut the cabinet door. Not to hide it, but to claim it. This wasn't secrecy. It was sovereignty. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for someone else to make the next move. I had made mine. Quietly, completely. A few days later, James sent a message asking if I'd like to come over again. He said he wanted to try dinner the right way this time. No distractions, just us. I waited a while before replying. Then I typed a simple yes. I called Sarah that same afternoon. We agreed to meet a block away from his house, just in case. She parked her car across the street and waited with the engine off, far enough not to draw attention, but close enough if I needed her. I wasn't nervous this time. I knew exactly who I was walking in as. Not a guest, not a mother seeking approval, a woman with her own name and her own ground to stand on. James opened the door with a smile that tried to look familiar. He wore a button-down shirt and socks, but no shoes, like he was trying to remind me of the boy who used to run barefoot through our old kitchen. The house smelled of garlic and rosemary. The table was set, bread, salad, warm plates. even music playing low in the background. Everything looked thoughtful, almost convincing. We made small talk. I asked how work was going. He asked if I'd been reading anything lately. I told him about a book I'd picked up at the library. He nodded but didn't ask what it was about. His eyes kept drifting toward the corner table. Another stack of papers sat there, clipped neatly with a small paperweight on top. Eventually, he reached for them and placed them on the dinner table. He said they were different this time, simpler, nothing binding, just a provisional agreement, a way to avoid confusion if things ever got complicated. His voice was softer now, practiced. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folded document. I placed it gently on top of his stack. No words, just paper meeting paper. He looked confused for a second, then unfolded it. His expression shifted slowly. Not anger, just a kind of slow comprehension, like someone realizing the game had already ended. It was a formal notice of trust execution, signed, final. All assets moved under a private trust with no shared access, no ability to override, no loopholes. I told him I appreciated his concern, that I understood the desire to plan ahead, but I already had a plan, and it was mine. He asked if I had spoken to someone. I nodded. A friend, someone who knew how to be prepared without being pressured. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then there was a soft knock at the door. Sarah stepped in with a smile that held no hostility, just calm professionalism. She introduced herself, then looked at me and asked if I was ready. I said yes. James didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, papers still in hand, watching as I slipped on my coat. I thanked him for dinner, and I walked out without looking back. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. Outside, the breeze tugged at the scarf around my neck. I didn't flinch. I breathed in. The air was cool, but it didn't sting. Sometimes, you don't need to raise your voice to make your point. Sometimes, the quietest step away is the one that echoes longest. The next morning, my phone buzzed just after 8. A short message from James sat on the screen. No greeting, no name. Just a line that read, "You made this harder than it had to be." I stared at it for a while. There was no anger in his words, just something colder, like I had failed to cooperate in a transaction he had counted on going smoothly. A few hours later, another message arrived. This one from Claire. It was longer, more polished, full of words like responsibility and concern. She said they were only trying to protect the future, that they respected me deeply and hoped I understood their intentions. Toward the end, she wrote something that stuck. "You raised a strong son. We just wanted to help him stay focused." It was worded kindly, but the message was clear. "Your role is done. Step aside." I didn't respond, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I finally understood the value of not explaining myself to people already committed to misunderstanding me. That afternoon, I sat by the window and scrolled through old photos. Birthdays, school plays, snow days with red cheeks and crooked smiles. So many moments I had given freely, thinking that love meant never saying no. Looking at them now, I saw a pattern I hadn't noticed before. I had taught him that love came without limits, that my silence was a kind of loyalty, that giving everything was just what mothers did. But love without boundaries doesn't build connection. It builds expectation. And once you stop delivering, it turns into disappointment. I put the phone down and folded my hands in my lap. The house felt still, but not hollow. For the first time, it felt like mine. I moved at the end of February, just before the last of the snow turned to slush. The new house was smaller, tucked behind a line of old pines not far from the lake. It had a crooked mailbox and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it felt right the moment I stepped inside. There was no guest room, no grand entryway, no space for dinner parties. Just a kitchen big enough for one, a reading chair by the window, and a bedroom that didn't echo. I brought only what mattered: a chipped blue kettle, a framed photo of Daniel, a ceramic owl from the garden that had never scared a bird in its life. Most mornings, I walked to the library on Main Street. Not for books, really, just for the quiet. The steady shuffle of pages turning, the small, polite hellos that didn't expect anything more. After a while, I started helping out behind the front desk. Nothing official, just something to do with my hands. That's where I met the others. Helen, who made quilts from her husband's old flannel shirts. June, who always carried peppermint tea in a dented thermos with her sister's initials scratched into the lid. And Margot, who used a cane but only when the ground was icy. We didn't talk about our pasts much. There were no confessions, no need. We just kept showing up at the same time, reaching for the same books, watering the same garden behind the library that we slowly made ours. We called it the quiet corner. We planted tomatoes and sunflowers and bits of lavender that took their time coming in. It wasn't fancy, but it grew. Things don't need to be loud to take root. There was peace in the routine, walking home with a bag of carrots, folding warm laundry, reading the same paragraph twice because the light was soft and nothing was rushing me. It felt like breathing again after holding it for too long. I stopped checking my phone every morning. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. I stopped waiting for someone to notice I was still here. I was no longer standing by, hoping to be invited back in. I had stepped outside the noise and made something of my own. It wasn't big. It wasn't loud. But it was mine. One chilly afternoon, I noticed a car parked quietly at the curb. James sat inside, the engine off, staring straight ahead. He didn't rush to the door. Instead, he sat on the porch steps like he used to as a boy, holding a plain white envelope. When I opened the door, I stood still for a moment before walking down the steps to meet him. His eyes were the same, but quieter, heavy with something I couldn't name. He said he was sorry, said he got overwhelmed and let the wrong things matter more than they should have. He held out the envelope but didn't ask for anything. No demands, no excuses, just an apology that felt honest. Finally, I didn't reach for the envelope right away. Instead, I sat down beside him, leaving enough space between us to breathe. I told him I forgave him, but forgiveness didn't come with a key to the past. Once doors close, I said, they need time. Maybe they open again someday. Maybe they don't. He nodded without argument. There was only quiet acceptance. Then he placed the envelope beside me and stood up. He walked back to his car without looking back. I didn't wave or call out. I just stayed seated, breathing in the cold air. That moment wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding, about knowing when love means saying no, about holding firm boundaries that protect what's left of your peace. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to let go, to forgive without forgetting, to release without regret, and to live on your own terms. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. In front of me was a blank sheet of paper and a pen that felt heavier than usual. I began writing a letter to the woman I used to be, the one who always said yes, who made herself small so others could feel tall, who thought silence would keep the peace. I told her I understood how exhausting it was to carry everything alone, how the weight of unspoken words and unmet needs had worn her down. But I also told her about the beauty in finally choosing herself, in setting boundaries that feel like an act of love, rather than defiance. The words came slowly, each one a gentle release. I wrote that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet breath before a long sigh, the soft closing of a door that no longer leads to safety. I told her it was okay to stop waiting for permission to live fully. After folding the letter, I reached for a small cake I had baked just for myself. I placed a single candle in the center and lit it with a match. The flame flickered softly, casting warm light on the worn pages beside me. I closed my eyes and made a wish not for anyone else, but for me, for a new beginning that didn't need explanation or approval, for the peace that comes from reclaiming your own voice and your own story. When I blew out the candle, the room didn't feel empty. It felt earned, like a quiet victory born from years of resilience and quiet rebellion. It was a moment just for me still, strong and true. If this story touches something quiet inside you, something you've held back for years, know you're not alone. Maybe you've stayed silent to keep the peace or made space for others until your own voice faded. But quiet doesn't mean weak. Walking away doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it means finally coming home to yourself. If you've ever felt invisible, I hope you find the courage to speak up and share your story. Because being heard is the first step back to being whole.